Okay, well, good afternoon. Welcome to the first seminar of the term of the Nathanson Centre Legal Philosophy Between State and Transnationalism seminar series. Today we're fortunate and honored to have with us Professor Adil Haque, who is Associate Professor of Law at Rutgers-Newark Law School and also a member of the Associate Faculty of Philosophy. Is it also Newark or?
No, that's New Brunswick.
Okay, Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Very different. So Professor Haque holds an AB from Harvard University as well as
Georgetown.
I'm so sorry. From Georgetown University, it's there in front of me. But you've also published in a Harvard journal.
That's true.
I got confused. But and a JD from Yale Law School.
Yes.
That is unmistakable. At Yale, Professor Haque was the executive director of the Yale Journal of International Law, as well as a senior editor of the Yale Law Journal. And from 2005 and to 2006, he served as a law clerk to the Honorable John O. Newman of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. He also worked as an associate in the New York office of the Beauvois Plimpton, where he focused on white-collar criminal investigations and prisoners' rights litigation. His scholarship focuses on criminal law, international criminal law, as well as the law of armed conflict. And he's published articles in many leading journals, including the New Criminal Law Review, Criminal Law and Philosophy, the Harvard Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Law Review, the Yale Journal of International Law, and so forth, as well as many important edited collections, such as recently the Anthony Duff and Stuart Green's the Philosophical Foundations of Criminal Law. And today he's going to present us a paper which was circulated, but for the sake of the seminar, we'll also present on killing in the fog of war. After this, we'll have a response by Mohamad Al-Hakim, who is a PhD candidate here in the Department of Philosophy, but also a Nathanson graduate fellow. We're very proud to have him here today. He's one of ours. Mohamad focuses on areas of social and political philosophy with a focus on, if I'm not wrong, Islamic political thought, law, and liberalism, also on criminal law theory, and he's also published in a number of leading journals, including Criminal Law and Philosophy, Philosophia, and the New Criminal Law Review. So our format is like it was last term. We'll have a short presentation, about 25-30 minutes by Professor Haque, followed by a response by Mohamad, and then we'll give a brief moment to Professor Haque to reply to the response if he wishes to do so, and then we'll open to the floor. So without further ado, Professor Haque.
Thanks. Thanks very much, everyone. And Francois, thank you so much for inviting me. So my paper is very long, and it's a little dense in parts. So first I want to thank everybody who read the paper, and I'm going to try to summarize kind of the big themes and tell you a bit about how I approach the topic. So the paper is about how certain soldiers have to be, that someone is a combatant rather than a civilian before using deadly force against them, and also how much risk soldiers have to accept in order to reduce the risk of mistakenly killing a civilian. So imagine that you are a soldier engaged in an irregular armed conflict with a non-uniformed enemy. You're fighting in an urban setting. Your unit comes under fire. You see someone on top of a building. They could be a sniper. They could be an onlooker. How sure do you have to be that they're the sniper rather than the onlooker before you fire at them? And if getting closer or entering the building where they are, or in some other way getting a better view of them and finding more information about who they are, what they're doing, would place you at greater risk. When do you have to accept that greater risk in order to reduce the risk of mistakenly killing a civilian? So that's what the paper is about. And what got me thinking about it was that it is a question that intersects with three of sort of the big changes in armed conflict over the last few decades. The first is the growth of irregular armed conflict in which states fight non-state actors who blend with civilian populations, and that creates this difficulty in terms of telling who's who. The second is asymmetric warfare, right? So the states tend to have substantially stronger military forces, and in some cases, not all, that allows them to be somewhat more cautious and restrained in their use of force if they wish to be. And one example of this is the use of drones, right? So we now have the capability, at least in certain conflicts, to monitor an individual for an extended period of time, observe their patterns of life, and only if we're very sure that they're a combatant use force and none of our soldiers will be at risk during that process. So in principle, that would allow us to be more restrained. And the third is the growth of what is called population-centric counterinsurgency theory. And this is basically the view that in certain armed conflicts where the goal is to win over the population to your side and to isolate your adversaries, you should accept greater restraints on your use of force for strategic reasons, not simply moral reasons. But nevertheless, this strategic context allows people like me who believe in moral restraints on the conduct of war to advocate for those restraints and hopefully find a more receptive audience on the military side. And so, okay, so that's sort of the context for the topic. And when I first started thinking about it, I was really struck and kind of surprised by how little there was out there in the literature about this, how few scholars had really looked into it and tried to present any kind of view toward answering these questions. And so, so I looked at the law of armed conflict, which is very suggestive and I think, says things that are along the right lines, but is not fully satisfying. So, for example, the law of armed conflict requires soldiers to distinguish between combatants and civilians, to exercise constant care, to spare civilians, to not use force in cases of doubt, to do everything feasible to verify that an individual is a combatant before using force, and to cancel or suspend an attack if it becomes apparent that an individual is a civilian. So all of this sounds really good, and yet there are some indeterminacies in the language of these rules that require some clarification. So, for example, how accurately or reliably must you distinguish civilians from combatants? What level of constant care must you exercise in seeking to minimize harm to civilians? How much doubt must you have in order to refrain from attack? What does it mean to do everything feasible to verify a target? How much risk do you have to accept to yourself in order to verify a target, and so on? So, the law is, I think, headed in the right direction, but there is enough indeterminacy to leave open some very important questions. And to resolve this indeterminacy, the few scholars who have really addressed this topic from within the legal literature tend to adopt what I call the balancing approach. The balancing approach basically says that both the level of certainty that you should have that somebody's a combatant before using force, and the level of risk that you should accept in order to minimize harm to civilians should vary based on the balance of military and humanitarian considerations. So as the balance tips in favor of humanitarian considerations, the required level of certainty goes up, as does the required level of risk. As the balance tips in favor of humanitarian considerations, as the balance tips in favor of humanitarian considerations, the required level of certainty goes up, as does the required level of risk. As it tips in favor of military considerations, the level of certainty goes down, as does the required level of risk. So in a very broad way, it's this idea of the balancing approach is one that seems comprehensible, but no one has really tried to spell out in any detail what it would mean to balance humanitarian and military considerations, what those considerations involve, and what this balancing process would involve, and how you could derive anything like a specific level of certainty or level of risk from this balancing process. So this is, I think, a big gap in the literature among people who favor this balancing approach. And so one question that I asked myself was, well, can this indeterminacy within the balancing approach itself be resolved or at least clarified in some way? And it occurred to me that this idea of balancing resembles in some ways the way that decision theorists and others think about this problem, how to act in the face of factual uncertainty. And basically what decision theorists do is they compare the costs of, the relative costs of error, right? So to simplify, we can talk about false positives and false negatives, right? So thinking that somebody is a civilian, killing them and finding out later that thinking that somebody's a combatant, killing them, finding out later that they're a civilian, it's false positive, or thinking that somebody's a civilian, sparing them, finding out later that they're a combatant, that's a false negative. And so decision theorists think that that once you can identify the costs of error and understand in some, at least rough way, their relative weight, you can actually derive a level of certainty that would warrant you in acting. So if the cost of falsely convicting someone of a crime, an innocent person of a crime, is 10 times greater than the cost of acquitting a guilty person, then the standard of the level of certainty that you should have in order to convict someone of a crime should be very high. There are two ways to represent this. One is in terms of ratio, right? So if it's 10 times worse to convict an innocent person than acquit a guilty person, you should be 10 times more sure that someone is guilty rather than innocent in order to convict them. That's sort of the ratio way of thinking about it. The other is in percentage terms, and there's a formula that they use to represent the level of certainty as a probability, a subjective estimate of likelihood. So the decision theoretic approach seems to capture something in the balancing approach, the idea of evaluating the costs either to the attacker or to the civilian population, comparing them in some way, and deriving a level of certainty that will vary based on the relative weight of these two potential errors. So it seems like a reasonable way to carry the balancing approach forward and tease out its implications. And the easiest way to assign some kind of values to it is to say that, for simplicity's sake, the cost of a false positive is that you'll kill a civilian. The cost of a false negative is that you will spare a combatant who may go on to kill one or more of your fellow soldiers. Obviously, there are other costs on both sides, potentially, but this is a simplifying assumption that I think is worth making for in order to tease out the view. And so what I basically do is try to see how far this gets us, and I conclude that it actually doesn't get us very far at all, that once we actually clarify what the balancing approach involves, it really does not seem very plausible, because it entails that if the cost to the attacking force is even slightly higher than the potential cost to civilians, then it is permissible to intentionally kill someone who you think is probably a civilian, right, in the off chance that they might be a combatant. And the greater the potential cost to the attacking force, the less certain you have to be that the individual you're thinking of targeting is a combatant. And this can lead to very extreme results where if the potential cost of the attacking force is that 10 members of the attacking force will be killed if the person turns out to be a combatant, then you can kill that individual even if there is only a 10% chance that they are in fact a combatant. So even if you are 90% certain that they're a civilian, there's a 10% chance that they pose a risk to 10 of yours, then it is permissible to kill them. And so I think that this result is highly implausible, and I try to explain why. I think basically the balancing approach ignores two very important moral asymmetries. The first is the asymmetry between killing and letting die. The second is the asymmetry between intentionally killing civilians and unintentionally killing civilians. So the first way to think about it is that, when we're evaluating the relative costs of error, we shouldn't just think about the harms involved, right? The harms to the attacking force and the harms to civilians simply as events or states of affairs. After all, soldiers and civilians are human beings. Their lives and welfare count equally. But there is, in general, a distinction between killing a person and allowing a person to die. We generally think that the former is substantially worse than the latter. And we can see this in a variety of ways. Generally, it is not permissible to kill someone either as a means or as a side effect of saving another person. And so the easy way to capture that idea is to say that killing is worse or harder to justify than letting die. And there are a variety of other places in which this asymmetry appears in kind of common moral sense. So that's the first problem with the balancing approach, that it weighs harms equally and doesn't really attend to the difference between killing and letting die, doing and allowing, and that seems problematic. And it's one reason why it leads to these very odd conclusions where it's permissible to kill somebody who you are twice as sure is a civilian rather than a combatant if they, in principle, would pose a threat to just two of your fellow soldiers. And that seems really, really bizarre. The second asymmetry that I think the balancing approach ignores is the distinction between intentional killing and unintentional killing. And this really comes up in the fairly extreme case where if 10 or, on a modified approach, 20 soldiers are at risk, it would be permissible to kill somebody even if you were only 10% sure that they were a combatant. Another way of saying it again is even if you were 10 times as sure that they were a civilian rather than a combatant. And this would be a good time for me to introduce an example, so let me do that. So the Marine Corps tests their troops in their rules of engagement. And they do this in situational exercises where they take them through kind of a mock firefight, but they also do it through tests, basically. And so in one of these tests, they pose the following hypothetical. You are in a military convoy, you're driving down a highway, you're about to pass underneath an overpass. On that overpass is a man. That man is holding an object. The object is about the size of a grenade, but you can't see what the object is, right? It could be a grenade, it could be a bottle, it could be, anything. So what do you do if that's all that you know? So this is a case in which there is some reason to believe that this person is a combatant and that they pose some threat to you. But it's a relatively weak reason, right? There's a guy with something in his hand. That happens. But if you are in a Humvee with 4 other Marines, or if you're in a truck with 10 or 20 other Marines, then in principle, right, if it turns out to be a grenade, the risk to your soldiers, the harm to your soldiers would be quite substantial, right? And so this would be a case in which the balancing approach would seem to say that it's permissible to kill the man on the overpass, even though you think it's much more likely that he's a civilian rather than a combatant, simply because the potential harm, even unlikely to your own troops, is substantial. And I think that this is a mistake. The Marine Corps thinks it's a mistake, and that this is really not permissible. And so the place where, at first, the asymmetry between intentional and unintentional killing comes up is if you are very sure that somebody is a civilian and you intentionally kill them, then it seems that if you intentionally kill somebody who you are very, very sure is a civilian, then you probably believe that they're a civilian. And if you intentionally kill somebody believing that they're a civilian, then you are intentionally killing a civilian. And under the law of armed conflict, and again, sort of ordinary moral thinking, this is one of the most serious wrongs you can possibly commit. And it's possible that it's unjustifiable in principle, If it is justifiable, it would only be in very extreme circumstances to prevent far greater harm to others. So those are my concerns about the balancing approach, are the reason why I think that it needs to be substantially modified, if not discarded. And so what I try to do in the next phase of the paper is try to develop an alternative view built on some of these moral asymmetries I've discussed. So the first part of it is to get a little bit more clear about what intentional killing involves. Certainly it means intentionally killing somebody believing that they're a civilian. I think it could also involve intentionally killing someone believing that they are probably a civilian. And the reason I think that, or more likely a civilian than a combatant, and the reason that I think that is that if you believe that somebody is probably a civilian, it would be irrational for you to conclude that they are in fact a combatant. And so even though you may have not made up your mind one way or another, which they are, that is not really to your moral credit, right? Because the only belief you could rationally form on that issue is the view that they are in fact a civilian, which is the inculpatory belief, not the exculpatory belief. So I think even the basic prohibition of intentional killing of civilians has at least that much of a broader scope. The problem is that even if we allow for that, the prohibition is still somewhat narrow and subjective in two ways. First, it would seem to sanction intentionally killing someone who you unreasonably believe is a combatant, right, against the evidence before you. And the other is that if you don't even consider, right, whether they're a civilian or not, you don't even bother to estimate whether they're probably a civilian or probably a combatant, you shoot first and ask questions later, this prohibition would not really seem to apply. And so that seems like a pretty big problem. So we don't want to rest there. And so then I really get into, kind of the heart of the paper, at least from my perspective. And the starting point for this is to say, look, in a way, the law of armed conflict and just war theory has sort of started off on the wrong foot, or at least can give you the wrong idea. This idea that it's wrong to intentionally kill civilians. It's a little misleading. What's really the case is that it is presumptively wrong to intentionally kill a human being. The fact that somebody's a civilian really doesn't change that, doesn't change their rights one way or another. It pretty much leaves them as is, right, with the rights that they have as human beings. It's just that if they're a combatant, that changes their rights in certain ways, right? If they become a combatant, they may make themselves morally liable to be killed, right? They may forfeit their right not to be attacked. And so rather than think that the fact that somebody is a civilian is a wrong-making fact, we should really flip it around and say, no, killing a human being, that's presumptively wrong. And only the fact that they are a combatant would justify you in committing that presumptive wrong, right? So you start out intentionally killing people is wrong unless justified by some circumstance. One of those circumstances might be if the person is a combatant. So what if you intentionally kill somebody believing that they're a combatant, believing that this justifying circumstance exists, but it turns out you're wrong and they're actually a civilian? What then? So, and what I say is, well, look, if they turn out to be a civilian, you're clearly not justified, right? Because the justifying circumstance doesn't exist. You were wrong about that. But you may be excused if you reasonably believe that that justifying circumstance exists. And the basic idea is that if you reasonably believe that the person is a combatant, even if your action is not justified, your action was based on a belief, and that belief was justified. And for that reason, we shouldn't blame you for what you did, right? You acted based on a justified belief. Things were not as you reasonably thought they were. So you did something wrong, but we can't really blame you for it. You did the best you could, or the most that we could demand of you, right? You thought about your situation, you examined the reasons to believe either that they're a civilian or a combatant. You formed a justified belief about that. You turned out to be wrong, and that's tragic, but it's not necessarily faulty. It's not a fault of yours. Right, and so what does reasonable belief mean? Basically, a reasonable belief is a justified belief. When is a belief justified? A belief is justified when the reasons for holding that belief are at least as strong as the reasons not to hold that belief. It means that it is, so it's reasonable to believe that somebody is a combatant if you have reason to believe that they are probably a combatant, if you have reason to believe, if you have most reason or strongest reason to believe that they're a combatant. And on the flip side, it's unreasonable to believe that somebody is a combatant if you have reason to believe that they're probably a civilian, or most reason or strongest reason to believe that they're a civilian. And that already sort of rules out the counterintuitive implications of the balancing approach, which of course was that it is sometimes permissible to kill somebody who is probably a civilian if the potential cost to your forces would be greater. So that's what I call the minimum threshold of certainty that you should possess before using deadly force. It should at least be the case that you reasonably believe that you're justified in using deadly force, and that means that your reasons to believe that the person is a combatant are at least as strong as your reasons to believe that they are a civilian. And this is, again, a minimum threshold, a baseline that every soldier has to reach before using deadly force in basically all circumstances. So one way to kind of visualize this is that on the balancing approach, the required level of certainty can rise from 0 to 100 and fall from 100 to 0 based on the relative costs of error. And basically I'm saying no, roughly the level of certainty can really never fall below 50%, let's say, just again to kind of visualize, except in very extreme circumstances, which I'll discuss briefly in a moment. So in a way, it kind of cuts the scope of permissible killing, not quite in half, but substantially. So that's the minimum threshold. And again, this is, I call it a aspect of deontological targeting because it's based on a non-consequentialist view of justification and excuse as moral categories. But this is not all, because we still have to ask, well, even if you reasonably believe that somebody is a combatant, does that mean that you can now fire at will? And I think the answer to that question is no. So again, I give this example. You are piloting a drone. You see on your monitor a group of armed men. They could very well be insurgents. They're in a group, they're carrying automatic weapons. There's a substantial reason to believe that they're combatants. But you also know that in this country or region, people carry weapons for self-defense and to defend their communities. And so they may very well be civilians who are just engaged in defensive behavior. So in a case like this, I think that if this group poses no immediate threat to anyone, then even if it is reasonable to believe that they're combatants, you really shouldn't use force against them. Because if, again, we take seriously the idea that killing is worse than letting die, and significantly worse than letting die, then really your reasons to believe that somebody is a combatant should be, as I say, equally, substantially, or proportionately stronger than your reasons to believe that they're a civilian. So if you're seriously thinking about killing somebody or killing 5 people, right, even if it is reasonable to believe that they're combatants, it would still not be justifiable or excusable to kill them, because the moral cost of doing so, of killing them, would be substantially greater than the moral cost of letting them go, which in this case is not clear at all. Right? They don't pose a threat to anyone. Now it's not clear that they'll pose a threat to anyone later. And so ideally you would track these people and monitor their behavior and see if you gather more information such that you can be much more sure that they are combatants rather than civilians before using deadly force. But if you can't spare those resources, then on these facts, I think you have to let them go. Right? Again, if we take seriously the idea that killing civilians is substantially worse than sparing combatants, then I think that has to be reflected in a higher level of certainty. And that level of certainty will vary based on the relative costs of error, much like the balancing approach suggested, but that variation will be adjusted to reflect the distinction between killing and letting die, and it'll also be limited by this reasonable belief threshold. So, again, to kind of go back to this sort of hand-waving thing that I'm doing, so on the balancing view, right, as the, let me do it from your view, as the costs of sparing a combatant go up, the required level of certainty goes down in a pretty straight line. On the view I'm suggesting, you could imagine it sort of first going down, let's see how the slope go. So it would go down less sharply, hit 50 and then basically flat line, right? So it would be, right, so it's right, so you will have to be considerably more sure that somebody is a combatant rather than a civilian than under the pure balancing approach. And if you can't reasonably believe that they're a combatant, then you can't use force basically at all, except maybe in very extreme circumstances. So those are kind of the big differences, right? So there's the reasonable belief threshold, and then the variation will be modified by the distinction between killing and letting die. So this is my view about targeting. And yeah, okay. And so that's sort of how I address question one. How sure do you have to be that somebody's a combatant rather than a civilian before using deadly force? And this is my answer to that question. That leaves us with the second question: how much risk do you have to take in order to find out for sure or to achieve the required level of certainty? And basically, I think you have to take all necessary risks to reach the required level of certainty. And that may seem very demanding, but I think it follows from what I've said before. And the reason basically is this: the required level of certainty, as I've presented it, already compares the costs of attacking and the costs of restraint. And so if the costs of acquiring more information are greater than the costs of simply holding your fire, then you should just hold your fire. And if the costs of acquiring more information are less than the costs of just holding your fire, then they certainly can't justify attacking, right? Because the whole point is that the costs of holding your fire can't justify attacking. So if the costs of finding out for sure are less than the cost of holding your fire, then they certainly can't justify attacking. So I think that once we establish the required level of certainty, soldiers have to take all necessary risk to achieve that level of certainty. So again, to make it slightly more concrete, recall the soldier under fire from the sniper. Say that a sniper isn't on the roof, they're in one of the apartments. You see somebody moving in one of the windows. They could be the sniper, they could be a civilian you don't know. Let's say that you can't reasonably believe that they're the sniper, you just don't have enough information. At this point, you have two options. You can enter the building, right, go room to room and try to find the sniper, or you can withdraw. And so basically, what I'm saying is that even if moving into the building would expose you to risk, right? The sniper might shoot at you while you're trying to move into the building. That risk, right, the risk of verification, can't justify staying where you are and shooting at whoever's moving in the window, right? Because if you can't reasonably believe that the person moving in the window is the sniper, that means you can't shoot them to avoid whatever harm they might cause you or your fellow soldiers. And so if the risk of going into the building and exposing yourself is greater than the risk of holding your fire, then you should just hold your fire. And if it's less than the risk of just holding your fire, then it certainly can't justify shooting at whoever is moving in the window. So at this point, you really have to choose, right, between accepting the risk of going into the building, holding your fire and standing pat, or withdrawing. But you can't use deadly force against whoever it is that you see in the window. So that's one aspect of the risk inquiry, right? So once we identify the required level of certainty, you have to take all necessary risk to achieve it before using deadly force. But there's another element of the risk inquiry, and this is sort of a general point that applies both when you're initially seeking information about a potential human target and, right, so putting the required level of certainty aside. But then it also applies even once you've reached the required level of certainty, you may be required to seek even more information. So when would that be the case? That would be the case, I think, when the risk to you of seeking that additional information is equal to or less than the risk that to civilians that would be avoided by acquiring that additional information. So, sorry. So this is, I think, one of the trickier, pardon me, I think this is one of the trickier parts of the paper in some ways to understand verbally. But basically the idea is, look, if, right, so if entering the building to pursue the sniper would expose you to greater risk, this, invites the question, must you take on that greater risk? But entering the building would also reduce the risk you pose to civilians because it would allow you to be more accurate in deciding who to target. So we have to compare these things, the greater risk to you and the lesser risk to civilians. And basically what I say is that you have to seek the additional information so long as the greater risk to you, the increased risk to you, is not substantially greater than the decreased risk to civilians. So if civilians would be, much better off if you took that extra precaution and used, acquired that additional information, then that is what you have to do. Okay, so those are really the kind of four elements of my proposal, right? So intentionally killing someone you believe is a civilian or is probably a civilian, that's ruled out of bounds by the general prohibition on intentionally killing civilians. Intentionally killing someone who you don't reasonably believe is a combatant is unjustifiable and inexcusable. Above the reasonable belief threshold, the level of certainty should vary both with the relative costs of error and with the asymmetry between killing and letting die. And finally, you have to take as much risk as is necessary to achieve the required level of certainty, as well as additional information, unless the increased risk to you would be substantially greater than the decreased risk to civilians. So those are kind of the four elements of my view, and I look forward to hearing what you all have to say about it.
Thank you very much, Adil.
Thank you so much for that. I just wanted to begin by first extending my gratitude to the Nathanson Centre for their kind invitation to respond to today's speaker. I, of course, also want to express my gratitude to Adil for a wonderful paper on an important and timely topic. It seems as though too many wars are being fought today, and the legal landscape around some of the difficulties associated with today's form of warfare requires a fresh perspective. We are certainly living in a time which guerrilla warfare is becoming the norm, and the distinction between combatant and non-combatant is becoming murkier day by day. Now, I found Adil's paper difficult to respond to, primarily because I found myself agreeing with much of what he had to say. Adil offers us a detailed account of the underlying rationale for what he calls the balancing approach. The balancing approach, which suggests that soldiers' level of certainty varies depending on humanitarian and military consideration, fails in one way or another to provide a fixed account of when soldiers are permitted to fire at enemy combatants or potential civilians. Now, at the foundation of Adil's criticism is the balance approach's failure to take seriously two important moral asymmetries, namely the difference between killing and letting die on the one hand, and intentionally killing and unintentionally killing on the other hand. Now, it is Adil's dissatisfaction with the balance approach's lack of recognition of such important moral distinction which leads him to consider his proposed alternative, namely the deontological targeting approach. So I want to take the opportunity today I want to take the opportunity in today's response to raise a few questions for Adil's account. As I said before, I find myself in much agreement with him, but of course agreement in academic discourse often makes for a boring session. So I think I will highlight a few difficulties and questions I had in hopes of helping Adil strengthen his account. The first difficulty I had with Adil's account was more speculative than anything. Adil seems to suggest that the balance approach, which is the adopted approach of the ILOC, completely disregard the moral asymmetries he highlights. But I was left wondering why the balance approach would elect to leave such moral asymmetries aside. On the one hand, and I believe this is Adil's suggestion, they just simply fail to take note of the moral distinction and the significant role they play in the analysis of soldiers' level of certainty. On the other hand, it may be possible that such considerations were, at one point or another, considered, but perhaps purposely left out. Now, this may be for a host of reasons. Perhaps such moral distinctions are difficult to assess given the wide and deep disagreement often found in legal, political, and moral discourse. Perhaps they are just too controversial to implement in codes of warfare. After all, we are discussing the circumstances in the fog of war, where life-altering decisions have to be made on the basis of the available information, with very little room for long-term deliberations on what course of action is best. So perhaps such considerations further complicate an already difficult situation for soldiers. Now, I was reminded of a paper I read several years ago, which featured an interview with a Dutch gentleman who took it upon himself to aid Jewish individuals seeking refuge from the Nazi regime during the fog of the Second World War. When he was asked whether he considered the potential harm that would befall him and his family in the event he was caught, he simply replied, and I quote, "The hand of compassion is faster than the calculus of reasoning." He didn't have time to consider all the ills that would befall him, but acted as he thought best. Now, we expect more out of our soldiers, who are trained for such situations, but we need to consider whether the purposeful act of leaving such controversial moral distinctions aside is indeed intentional. I thought that you did a good job of showing how these moral distinctions are understood, but I think you didn't spend enough time talking about the difficulties in the literature over acknowledging whether these distinctions are actually well understood or not, and they've certainly surfaced in many legal cases in the United States and so on. Now, Adil paints a dismissive picture of the balance approach. As he puts it, the balance approach simply fails to take account of such distinctions. So I'm just left wondering whether they were overlooked or intentionally taken out of consideration. I think a more complete account may want to touch on the rationale of such a move by those who advocate the balance approach. My second set of concerns is directed at the latter part of the paper. Adil develops a series of arguments which build on the moral distinctions he highlights. His conclusion, to put it in straightforward terms, requires that soldiers maintain a fairly high level of certainty before taking action, in other words, firing at combatants. Adil's concern, though, has as much to do with reducing the death of innocent civilians as it does with determining the level of responsibility or culpability of soldiers in foggy circumstances. This is all found in his discussion of responsibility, justifications, and excuses. But I wonder whether the standards, despite Adil suggesting the contrary, are still placed too high. Here I want to highlight a passage from the work of Anthony Duff to help make my point. So I have this slide here just so it's at least conceptually clear some of the distinctions that Anthony Duff draws out when he talks about justification and excuses. So Anthony Duff, in his discussion of the often cited dichotomy between justifications and excuses, he notes that the distinction is much more complex and layered than is often discussed in the literature. In particular, Duff suggests that there are considerations from the field of epistemology that bear important insight on how we understand the justifications of our conduct. So here Duff presents 4 conditions that we have to think about between truth and justification, or truth and justification. So here we can take A to be the soldier's belief, and we can take P to represent that the enemy is a combatant. So I think the first one and the last one apply directly to what Adil has to say today. So in the first one is, if the soldier believes that the person in front of them is an enemy combatant, could be true, and is justified, that is, she holds the belief for good or adequate reasons, then P is indeed the case. We think that in that scenario, he or she should be able to fire their gun without any kind of criticism, legal or moral. In the last scenario, where A believes that P could be false and unjustified, P is not the case, that is, it's not an enemy combatant, and A has no good reason to believe that P. I think it's one of those circumstances where they should never fire their gun. But then there are these 2 conditions in between, which invoke an idea often discussed in the literature, especially when it comes to criminal responsibility, the idea of moral luck. So in the second scenario, you can see what we might call bad moral luck, in the sense that it turned out that it was an enemy combatant, but they didn't have any good justification for believing, and so they don't fire. In the third condition, you can see how they could have morally good luck, where it turns out to be false even though they were justified. So, like I said before, I take it from Adil's stated position that he's in favor of the first one and the last one. But what about scenarios B and C? These 2 scenarios invoke the old debate over the role of moral luck, whether it be good or bad luck. Now, in the fog of war situation, I imagine, for purposes of understanding soldiers' level of certainty in relation to responsibility, moral luck may indeed be an important idea that seems to get no play at all in Adil's account. So I'm just wondering what role moral luck might play in the accounts presented today, and how moral luck may be understood in the fog of war situation. So my question really is, does Adil's account place higher restrictions on soldiers than he's willing to acknowledge? Is his account, in other words, too restrictive? That is, only when we have true and justified knowledge can they fire, and only when they, but all the other conditions, that especially the middle 2, don't seem to ever give soldiers a justification for firing. So those are the 2 main concerns that I have with the paper. I know they're very general, but I was just trying to make sense of how the fog situation actually factored into your paper, because by the end of it, it seemed like we weren't talking about a fog of war situation anymore. It seemed like we had lots of time to deliberate and collect more evidence and so on. And finally, just as a last point, just coming from a philosophy background, I think the idea of fog itself needs to be better analyzed. So what do I mean by this? The assumption seems to be that there's only one type of fog. But surely this cannot be correct. Sometimes the fog is significantly dense and visibility is extremely poor. Perhaps beyond one's own immediate surroundings, they are unable to make heads or tails of much else. Other times, fog can be less dense and visibility is not so bad, even though it can be better. Are we to assume the worst case scenario fog and build our view of responsibility and certainty on such an assumption? Or will we need to adjust our level of responsibility and responsiveness to the degree of fog? If so, then can we derive a rule of thumb, as Adil seems to have done for us today, for dealing with the all-important question of killing in the fog of war? So those are just my, in general, three considerations.
Oh, thanks very much. Okay, so So why do the proponents of the balancing approach ignore the asymmetries between killing and letting die and intentional and unintentional killing? If so, why would they do that? Might they have good reasons for doing so? I mean, the main thing is, so the people who put forward the balancing approach really don't even come close to discussing these issues at all, right? They talk in very broad ways about military and humanitarian considerations, and they don't really talk about how the consequences on the military side or the humanitarian side come about. So although it's possible that they've thought these issues through and decided that they're not important, or they've thought about these asymmetries and decided that either they're not sound in general or they're not relevant to the context of armed conflict. My guess is that they just haven't thought about any of this because, again, their views or their elaboration of the balancing approach is not very detailed. So I just don't think they've really wrestled with these issues. As for moral luck, so I can see how this may not always be clear, but I mean, so the basic idea is if you are telling soldiers how to act, what you're telling them is act only on the basis of reasonable or justified beliefs. And if you do that, so that's A and C. So if you act on the basis of justified beliefs, either your action will be justified because it'll turn out that your belief is true, so both your action and your belief are justified, or your belief will turn out to be false, so your action will turn out to be wrong. But because your belief is justified, you will be excused, right? You acted on the basis of a justified belief, so you are not to blame for the fact that the belief turned out to be false. So in that way, the moral luck, bad moral luck, is not attributable to you. So really, my view is about, that's how my view relates to A and C. Clearly, D is right, is the extreme case, right, where you your belief that somebody is a combatant is false. You kill them, so you've committed a presumptive moral wrong, and you're neither justified because they're not a combatant, nor excused because your belief that they were a combatant is unjustified and unreasonable. So there you've committed a wrong, you're not justified, you're not excused, so you are morally in the red. And so that kind of leaves us with B, and so that's really the good moral luck case, right? And soldiers sometimes talk about spraying and praying, right? You shoot and you just kind of hope that you hit, right, a combatant. And that's sort of what B is really about, right? So your belief is not justified, but your action, right, by luck turns out to be objectively justified because they are in fact combatants, they are in fact liable to be killed. So in this case, you are in some ways kind of morally defective, but you haven't actually committed an unjustified wrong. So in that way, you're kind of the beneficiary of good moral luck. So that's certainly interesting, and it's worth thinking about whether, how to deal with cases like that, whether we should think of soldiers like those in case B as being morally blameworthy or potentially legally responsible in some way. So it's a very interesting thing to think about. But I think most of what I'm concerned about is in A, C, and D. So I think that's so I think that's kind of what I'm focused on in this paper. And as for the how different conflicts might involve sort of different fogs. You know, I'm sure that's true, right? There'll be conflicts in which, you know, some people wear uniforms, others don't. Maybe they don't wear uniforms, but they have some other kind of distinguishing mark or behavior. Maybe they operate in urban settings where it's, you know, very crowded, and so they're intermingled with civilians. Or they might be operating in rural settings where everybody's kind of spaced apart, at least much of the time. So certainly, I mean, different conflicts will raise different issues. And the hope is that, or my hope was that the approach that I lay out, and then the actual rules or proposals that I offer, which I didn't have a chance to discuss, but the rules of engagement, the kind of model rules of engagement that I propose are simple enough for soldiers to, you know, be trained in and apply under pressure, but will still lead them to make better decisions than they would left essentially unguided and simply told to, you know, do their best. So that's the goal, and so hopefully that's something that will be useful across conflicts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adil. So we have questions. So I'll start with Philippe and then. We have a microphone, and so if you can please speak in the microphone when you ask your question for purposes of recording. Thank you.
Thank you. This was very interesting. So I've heard that you like cases, so I thought I'd present you with a case.
Great.
Yep. So I share a lot of your intuitions, and I find this very attractive. But here's a case where I'm not sure what to say. So I know for a fact that there's a guy with a cell phone who's going to blow up 5,000 troops.
Yep.
And I have this equipment that allows me to see everybody on the relevant territory. And excuse me, there are 3 guys with cell phones that I see.
Sure.
And so for each of them, the probability that it's him is 33%.
Yep.
But in this case, one is tempted to say, if there's really nothing else to do, you could blow up all 3 of them.
Yeah, so I do talk about this a bit. So there are 2 sets of issues. So one is, what kind of deontological view should we have? If we're what are called threshold deontologists, then we believe that rights, let's say, trump our pursuit of good consequences, but only to a point. There are other ways of characterizing this. So the idea is that intentionally killing, let's say, a completely innocent person, right? So you know, so I'm going to sort of confirm the idea that I like playing with cases. But so let's say that the person who set up the cell phone to detonate the explosive passes it off to somebody else, right, who has no idea that the cell phone has this function, but the next phone call they make will in fact set off these explosive devices. So this is a completely innocent person, right? They are not directly participating in hostilities. And yet some people might say, so intentionally killing them would be wrong unless it would prevent far greater harm to others. Some people talk about averting catastrophic moral horror or averting a supreme emergency. And other people just talk about, again, preventing far greater harm to others, preventing far more people from being killed. It may be acceptable to kill an innocent person. And in the paper, I'm actually agnostic about this. But if you were a threshold deontologist, if you believed that it could be permissible to intentionally kill somebody to prevent far greater harm to others, then it might also be permissible to intentionally kill somebody to prevent far greater expected harm to others, where expected harm is the harm you might prevent, right, if they turn out to be the one with the bad cell phone, discounted by the probability that they are in fact that person. So, you know, say that it's in general permissible to kill, intentionally kill an innocent person to prevent 1,000 people from being killed. If there's a 33% chance that killing this person would prevent 300 people from being killed, it's possible, I don't know, but threshold deontologists may say, then that's okay. because yeah,
But
yeah, sure.
if I may
Yeah, no, please.
interject.
Yeah, please.
Well, so one of the my case wasn't very clear, because it's true, there is the intuition, if you just pile up enough people, then anything goes. But then I also meant to worry about the something a little bit arbitrary seeming about the 50%, which is, so if there's only 2 guys with cell phones, then for each of them it's true that they have a 50% chance of being a combatant, and so then it seems the threshold would be much, much lower. And it seems weird that adding a 3rd guy with a cell phone suddenly means that you need thousands of troops to justify killing them.
Right.
But if there's only 2 guys, you could just shoot them both.
Right, to avert much less harm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I don't have that intuition.
right. So yeah. So and so I actually have a case like that too, where you have information that somebody is going to pull out an automatic rifle and start shooting around in a marketplace, and you have a physical description, even pictures of the guy, right? And so if there's one person who shows up in the marketplace looking like that, it might be permissible to fire at them, intentionally killing them, even if 2 nearby civilians would get hit, and so they would be unintentionally killed, right? But it might not be permissible if there are 3 people, right, who match the description, because then of each of them, you couldn't say that you reasonably believe that each of them is that person or is liable to be killed. And this raises precisely, basically the same issue. If you reasonably believe that somebody is liable to be killed, then you can kill them to avert some substantial harm to others. But if you don't, if it's even sort of just unreasonable to believe that they're liable to be killed, then suddenly you can't intentionally kill them unless it would prevent far greater harm to others. And that seems a little, right? And my only real response is that this is a characteristic of all deontological views, right? All of them. If you believe that there's an absolute prohibition against torture, right, then you have to believe that there's some level of pain that you can inflict on somebody, right, short of torture, right, that might be permissible to prevent harm to others. But just a little bit more that puts it in the torture range, suddenly, no, you can't anymore, right? Same with killing, right? If you take somebody's life intentionally, right, and they're an innocent person, you can only do that to prevent far greater harm to others. But if you harm that person, injure them, right, then that might be permissible to prevent substantially less harm to others, right, less than the first case. Right, so this feature, right, that a small differences in the way you bring about a harm can have make a large moral difference, is just a feature of non-consequentialist views. Think about what non-consequentialism is, right? It's the idea that it is sometimes permissible to bring about a good outcome in one way, but not in another way, right? Maybe through letting die, but not through killing. Maybe through unintentional killing, but not through intentional killing, right? The idea of non-consequentialism is how you go about it matters. The causal structure matters, your intentional state matters, right? Your beliefs matter. All of these things can affect whether it's permissible to cause harm to some people in order to avert harm to others. And so, yeah, so this is going to be something that every non-consequentialist view has to confront. And just to use one last one, right? So if you if you launch an attack on a legitimate military target, right? It might be permissible to do so even if it kills a certain number of civilians as an unintended side effect. And yet, if you could achieve the same military advantage by intentionally killing one civilian, that would be impermissible, right? So if you, right, so the same outcome, right, you destroy the factory or whatever it is. But if you do it unintentionally, right, it's justifiable even if you kill several people, right? But you can't bring out about the same outcome by intentionally killing one person, right? So again, any non-consequentialist view is going to have this feature, right? And so my view is just has that same element. And at a certain point, I think I and others just have to decide whether that's something that that we think is true, and therefore we should accept, even though it can seem paradoxical in some ways. But yeah, it's I think a very very important challenge. Yeah.
Thank you. Please pass the microphone.
I just wanted to address like the issue of that idea of certainty before you're allowed to shoot.
Mm-hmm.
Can we establish some sort of objective standard, or is that a subjective belief in that soldier's mind at that time, and do we take that as being that standard?
Yep.
Because the consequences of being charged with, negligent discharge,
mm-hmm.
whatever.
Yep.
They're criminal sanctions,
right.
And with criminal consequences. And if we're going to treat soldiers in that way as a consequence,
mm-hmm.
what sort of standard is required?
Yep.
And I think when you use that scenario of cell phones, I'll say that right now, like our light armor vehicles, whatnot, they all have this jammer that
mm-hmm.
blocks cell phone
mm-hmm.
signals
yep.
to prevent IEDs from exploding.
Mm-hmm.
But that protection isn't 100%.
Right.
We know it fails sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So under our standard operating procedure so far in our rules of engagement, if we do see someone in a convoy
mm-hmm.
and we see someone,
yeah,
he's going to get shot.
Mm-hmm.
There's no two ways about it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason for any person to look at that convoy
mm-hmm.
without speaking into a cell phone, he's just
yep.
pressing buttons.
Mm-hmm.
There's no other reason except for the fact that he's trying to blow up that vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason why it's not happening
mm-hmm.
is because
of the
protection.
Mm-hmm.
And you spoke about the example of, someone holding an object and
yep.
in the bridge scenario. But I wonder morally that, for that soldier to shoot that person
mm-hmm.
without that certainty,
mm-hmm.
I think it is very contextually dependent.
Mm-hmm.
Whether what is that level of threat in an area?
Mm-hmm.
How do these people
sure.
operate? Sure.
Yep.
Can we not say that for that soldier not to take that shot,
mm-hmm.
knowing that if he takes that shot, he may be morally blamed for it,
mm-hmm.
and he may undergo some investigations or sanctions,
mm-hmm.
but he may also save the lives of 5, 6, whatever the number of people in the vehicle in front of him is.
Sure.
And we ascribe to our soldiers that concept of teamwork
mm-hmm.
and self-sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Can we not say that it is justified, not merely excused?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we ought to commend him for taking that very difficult moral decision
mm-hmm.
so that he could save the lives of others,
yeah.
potentially.
Sure. So a lot of stuff in your question. So first, when I talk about the required level of certainty, I mean the level of certainty warranted by the information or the evidence before you, right? So it's an objective standard in that sense. Although obviously a soldier will, when we talk to a soldier, you say, look, you need to have, this level of confidence based on the evidence. So for the soldier, it'll be both. It'll be a subjective standard and an objective standard. For the third party, it's just objective. Right. So the second thing is, so I don't argue in this paper about, or say anything in this paper about the criminal consequences of failing to reach the required level of certainty and take the required level of risk. And as I'm sure you know, there are various gaps between the laws of armed conflict and war crimes. So just because something is a violation of the law of war doesn't necessarily make it a war crime. So you want to?
Yeah, between war crimes, I mean, in Canada we have something called Queen's Regulations and Orders.
Mm-hmm.
It brings within a domestic context what you do overseas on operations in general. And it's already been brought into that fold.
Right, but right. So
so that gap has, for us has been closed, and I think from a practical point of view, in its application.
So I don't know the Canadian law. What I assume it does is say that here are acts that constitute war crimes under international law. We are making them crimes under Canadian law as well. So that's closing the gap between war crimes and domestic Canadian crimes. I'm talking about a different gap between war crimes and violations of the law of armed conflict. So there are a variety of ways in which you can violate the laws of armed conflict without committing a war crime, right? So there's a violation of the law of armed conflict not to give officers who are taken prisoner certain quarters, or not to deny them male privileges and things like that. So there are a variety of things that the law of armed conflict prohibits, and obviously soldiers should obey those laws, but it is not a war crime to violate them. And so to bring it a little bit closer to home, if it is the law of armed conflict says, distinguish between civilians and combatants, take constant care, etc., but it's only a war crime to intentionally kill civilians, right? So war crime or international criminal law generally does not have, a negligence standard, which is what the principle of distinction would maybe initially lead you to think, right? If my proposal for sort of reinterpreting the laws of armed conflict, they don't entail that every violation of those modified or reinterpreted laws must entail criminal liability. These are two separate questions, right? So if a soldier fails to comply, maybe the remedy should be the response should be something else, right? It could range from, reprimand and, more training in the rules of engagement to discharge, but it may not involve imprisonment or criminal sanctions. So there are kind of a variety of ways we could deal with or respond to a soldier who doesn't take the required steps. And then the last thing that you said, which I think is very important, is that, of course, soldiers have certain duties toward one another, right, to protect one another, and they take these duties extremely seriously. The question is whether those duties offset or override the moral principles that I discussed, the asymmetry between killing and letting die, between intentionally killing civilians and unintentionally killing civilians. And my argument is that they do not. And so for a couple of reasons. One is that in general, it's not really permissible to shift risk from one person onto somebody else who hasn't voluntarily assumed that risk. And it's even harder to justify shifting risk if the first person, the person who's at risk now, did voluntarily assume that risk. And so to shift risk from a soldier who to some extent has assumed the risk of combat and shift it onto civilians, that doesn't really seem appropriate. Second, if a soldier couldn't kill a civilian in order to protect themselves, it seems a little bit weird to say, well, but somebody else can kill a civilian for him, right? It would be strange if my right to protect you is broader than your right to protect yourself. So if it wouldn't be okay for you to kill a civilian as a side effect of saving yourself, it would be weird for it to be permissible for me to kill a civilian unintentionally to protect you. And those are really the two more important ones. I have some other arguments, but they're less significant. So I definitely think that soldiers are at tremendous risk. They rely on one another to get them through that experience. They do have duties toward one another, and it's right that they take them seriously. But at the end of the day, I don't think those duties can justify killing civilians or putting civilians at greater risk. So,
Adil, your account is very rationalistic, right? You claim that you need at least a reasonable belief that somebody is a combatant in order to be able to shoot a person justifiably or justifiably or excusably. Now, part of the fog of war is not that just there's many things going on. It's also that there's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, yeah.
The emotions are running high, right? The heat of the moment. Is it your claim that phenomenal experiences that soldiers undergo cannot ever excuse them, right? The kinds of pressure that they're under. You could think that because they're soldiers, because they're trained, because of the kinds of claims and oaths and all sorts of things that soldiers do, the standards of fortitude that applies to them are extremely high. But is it your claim that they're absolute? Because it seems to me that one way in which our judgment can be distorted is of course, because we make mistakes with respect to the evidence, but there's also another unmediated way in which we apprehend the world, which is through our emotions, right? So the fear, the anger, and so where is there space for this in your account, or do you discount this, or do emotions for you just play a role vis-a-vis beliefs, and we should discard the more unmediated kind of impact it can have on us? So that's the first question. The second one has to do with this idea of reasonable belief. Now, what role does this word reasonable play in your account? You say, well, in the individual context, individuals under the criminal law should form a reasonable belief to be excused, at least under the heading of reasonable mistake and justification. So do government. Governments should also form a reasonable belief. But presumably that word reasonable means different things in different contexts, right? And somewhere in the paper you seem to reject the fact that that role can play a role here, as in the fact that they're soldiers, the fact that they're trained, the fact that they claim certain authority might make the level of reasonableness, as it were, higher than it is for any ordinary citizens. Or is reason a uniform thing for you? The kind of assessment is the same in both cases. And that leads me to a related point with respect to the threshold deontologist, right? It seems to me that somebody faced with the end of the world and somebody's about to, or they think is about to press the button that will send nuclear bombs and destroy everything. Well, there's still an idea of reasonableness here at stake, right? It's just because of the context, what is reasonable might just vary. So it's not a very different kind of case. We're still asking that the shooting be justifiable or excused. It's just that given the context, it ought to be different. And one last point: the distinction civilians-combatant, right? So you say combatant are people who are directly involved in hostilities. So the hitman, the politician that organizes all of this, and in fact has the power to say stop. Is that a combatant too? Or do you need somebody in uniform with the guns? And I just want to see what the remit of the account is.
Okay, sure. Okay, so thank you very much. That's a lot. Okay, so first on emotion. Yes, I think that if a soldier acts not on the basis of a reasonable belief, but on the basis of a reasonable emotion, then in principle that can be excusatory. The reason why I don't discuss that here is because my goal here is to tell soldiers what to do and what standards they should aspire to meet. And you don't exactly tell soldiers, form epistemically justified beliefs unless you're really scared or angry, as the case may be. You just tell them no, right? Form reasonable beliefs, act on justifiable beliefs, right? Don't kill civilians unless you're, this sure that don't kill people unless you're this sure that they're combatants. And that is what will guide their actions, right? And then if, because of panic or rage or whatever, they do something that would that's wrong and unjustifiable, there may be circumstances under which you'd either mitigate their blameworthiness or not blame them at all. But again, that's not really something that that's not guidance to the soldier, right? That's sort of after the fact when we're evaluating their conduct. So on the front end, you just want to say, be reasonable, and then if for If they're not, that's something we deal with at a later stage. So does reasonable belief vary by role? Not exactly. I mean, I think that, so what constitutes a reasonable belief, I think is invariant, right? It's belief based on an undefeated reason, and that I don't think changes from role to role. What changes is, your training, your experience, right? So, so if in a certain region you find that some bit of behavior that might seem innocuous to somebody outside of it is in fact a very reliable sign of hostile intent, then that may change what is reasonable to believe. But the nature of reasonable belief doesn't change. It's just what constitutes reasonable belief and how well prepared you are to form reasonable beliefs under certain circumstances. And then for the threshold deontology stuff, I may have misunderstood your question. I think that there's the reasonableness of your action, which can kind of sort of encompass the presumptive wrongfulness, the justifiability, and a bunch of other stuff. So you could say that in the case where harming one person would avert catastrophe, that it's reasonable to harm that person. And I guess that's okay, but again, I'd want to kind of break things down a little bit more and say, well, it's presumptively wrong, but it's justifiable, and if your belief is justified, then you're acting on the basis of a reasonable belief, etc. And I'd kind of want to pry those things apart a bit. And then for the who is a combatant, I try to, in this paper, really not get into any real debates about who's liable to be killed in war. I just say, look, under the law, it's members of armed forces, members of organized armed groups who perform a continuous combat function, as well as civilians who take a direct part in hostilities, and a direct part could mean carrying out an operation. It could also mean planning an operation, and facilitating or coordinating it, which I think was the case that you were suggesting. So I'm just sort of taking those as given for now. I have views about whether some of those categories should be tweaked a bit, but here I'm trying not to get sucked into those debates because I have other fish to fry.
Francois,
Microphone.
Francois sort of stole part of my question because I was going to ask about the. Well, no, it's good actually because it shows that I'm not out there in my thinking, so that's helpful.
Or that you are, yeah, confirms actually.
That's true too, but at least I'm not alone out there, so that's good. So you talked about, so it's Francois' question about, I guess, I don't want to paraphrase because I don't want to assume that I know what he was asking or what he was getting at, but you do make some assumptions about or I'm assuming you make some assumptions about the distinction between combatant and non-combatant as per the Geneva Conventions, etc. But I was sort of looking at your paper and wondering about the sort of idea of the moral worthiness of the non-combatant or the civilian in terms of, in the larger sense, and how that plays into sort of guilt and innocence and how those concepts can be separated. So for example, in the idea of, so for example, there are some people who say that, some scholars who have said that even participating in a democratic government where you voted for that leader who then chose to wage war, in some way makes you complicit. And I don't, you've already said that you haven't really gotten into those nuanced.
I have, just in other papers.
Right, in this paper, sorry,
Yeah,
I mean in
sure.
this paper. So I was going to ask you about that. And the other thing I was going to ask you is this idea that war is a political act and therefore combat is in itself a means to an end. How does that play into your proposed deontological theory when war is, by some accounts, necessarily a consequentialist act?
Okay. Can you actually say just a tiny bit more about the last question? I just want to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly.
Sure. So, I mean, there are some other papers I was looking at in my research, and they talk about the idea of war as a political act, right? It's not that soldiers themselves get up one morning and decide to go kill somebody,
right,
or wage a war. It's that there is some government, some leader, some head, some rebel faction, somebody has at the top of some pyramid of chain of command said, this is we're trying to achieve something, and the way we're going to achieve that is we're going to wage a war.
Right.
A military intervention or a military incursion rather than using diplomacy or economic sanctions or whatever. So war is in and of itself then, by some accounts, a consequentialist act, right? It's being used to achieve an end.
Right.
So do you think that concept, that idea trickles down in every act the soldier does? That they are a tool, and therefore there's really no way to ascribe a kind of deontological
Constraints or something.
yes, constraints to their actions.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so on your first question, I reject the view that civilians can be liable to attack either through voting in elections or paying taxes or waving flags at rallies or things like that. I think liability to be killed is quite narrow. Really, you have to forcibly resist soldiers who are fighting for a just cause, so unless you're really taking up arms, participating in hostilities, you're really not liable to attack. So that's what I think about the merits. But again, I think I can really bracket that debate because in any event, the circumstances I'm talking about here are circumstances in which the question is whether this person poses a threat, not because posing a threat is the linchpin of moral liability to harm, because obviously there are people who deny that, but because in evaluating whether you're certain enough, right, part of that inquiry will mean evaluating, well, what happens if I'm wrong in one direction or in the other direction? And so from that perspective, the threat they pose or the threat in which they're kind of intricately involved, it is the dominant factor. So even if a civilian becomes liable to be killed from voting in an election, that doesn't really change whether, as long as it's not, every civilian or something, as long as there's some doubt about whether they're liable to be killed or not, you still have to ask, well, if, what threat do they pose, right? So if they turn out not to be liable, right, then I've done something very wrong. And if they are liable but they pose no threat, then that's really not, then I haven't really achieved much either. So in that case, I better be really, really sure that they meet whatever criteria of liability exists. So in any event, we're really going to be focused on circumstances in which the question is, how much of a threat does this person pose? And that's irrespective of our view about the basis of moral liability to killing in war. So it's certainly true that wars have aims, right? There's some end state that the parties are seeking, I don't think, so first I don't think that makes war a consequentialist enterprise, because there are all sorts of constraints on the pursuit of that cause. Just on the use ad bellum level, right? Proportionality, last resort, all this other stuff. And similarly, there will be constraints on the conduct of war. So I don't think the mere fact that war has an aim, that doesn't make it into a consequentialist enterprise. There can still be constraints of various kinds, and then these would just be additional constraints, or a better understanding of the constraints that already exist. Yeah. So why don't I leave it there probably. Yeah.
Yes, Professor Hodgson, the microphone, please.
Oh, which way? That way?
Slightly different question, maybe playing the devil's advocate a little bit, but one way to put pressure on your view would be to emphasize the extent to which those who engage in guerrilla warfare are guilty. And a lot of the guilt for whatever happens will fall on them. Mm-hmm. So one way in which this is clearly the case on your view is that by engaging in guerrilla warfare, I change what it's reasonable for the soldiers to believe. Mm-hmm. Right, so sometimes it'll be reasonable to believe that a civilian is a combatant, mm-hmm. but if we all had uniforms, it would never be reasonable.
Right.
So, and presumably if a soldier reasonably believes that a civilian is a combatant, mm-hmm. then the moral guilt for that somehow falls on the guerrilla fighters mm-hmm. at some level. But then one question might be, why not put more guilt on the guerrilla mm-hmm. fighters? Yeah. Why not say, if a civilian looks like he poses a significant risk, then I'm justified mm-hmm. in shooting him. And if I'm wrong, the guilt falls on the guerrilla fighters.
Yeah.
So why stop where you stop in mm-hmm. how much moral blame we're willing to transfer to them?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think really it comes down to the fact that, well, I think that we are responsible for what we do in the context that or the situation in which we find ourselves. And so from my perspective, it doesn't really matter why it's hard for me to distinguish civilians from combatants, whether it's because combatants are deliberately, intermingling with civilians and fighting from within their communities, or that, or if, it's night and it's just hard to see kind of who's who. Whatever the reason is that it's hard for me to distinguish civilians from combatants, that's just the situation that I face. And so there are questions to ask about, so if the opposing combatants are doing something wrong, if they're using human shields, if they're intermingling with civilians, if they're doing other wrongful acts, then they're accountable for them. But I'm accountable for my own actions, and so from my perspective, I don't see how it affects the permissibility of my action, why or how it came to be that it's hard to tell who's who. I just know that it's hard to tell who's who, and I have to do the best I can with the situation that I have. Yeah. And just to use a quick analogy, I think the same thing about human shields, right? So from my perspective as a soldier, it doesn't really matter to me why there are civilians, near a military target, whether whether they've been placed there as human shields, or they just live there, or they're just passing by. All I need to know is there are civilians near the target, and now I need to decide whether it's still proportionate to attack that target. So it's the same kind of thought. This is my situation. I have to do the right thing in it. Doesn't really matter how the situation arose.
I guess the worry, again, I'm being the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Probably really the devil's advocate. But what people will say against that is that then you're making yourself, you can be an instrument in the hands of these evil people, right? So these evil people, they know that if they can have 3 people with cell phones out there, or if their guy can be one of 5 who look alike, then your hands are tied.
Right.
So they have to make sure that there's not just 2 guys who look alike.
Yeah.
So you seem to be, the worry is you're very easy to play with for them.
Sure.
And there's a question, can you just say, no, actually, I can fight back.
Yeah.
And everything, everyone I kill is on the bad guys.
Yeah. So the first concern is that line of argument can be used with any rule of war, right? Any rule of war can be manipulated by the other side. So we're talking about distinction, right? The rule is distinguish between civilians and combatants. It's manipulated by combatants to dress like civilians. Proportionality is another one, right? That's one of the reasons why people use human shields or intermingle, right? So there are a lot of people around, and that'll change the proportionality calculus and make it disproportionate to strike certain targets. So whatever rules we impose in warfare can be manipulated, all of them. And Leo Katz thinks that it's just the nature of rules that they can be manipulated, and they'll have gaps and loopholes and can be exploited in various ways. So, I mean, ultimately, I think the question is just, do these rules have a compelling moral justification? And if they do, then I think we have to, to some extent accept the fact that they will be manipulated in some way or make it harder to fight, harder to win in certain conflicts. And so that's not kind of a unique problem to my proposals. That's a problem for any proposal to regulate war by rules rather than just by consequentialist calculations.
Just to take you back to the initial consequentialism, because that's obviously the extreme case. You seem to say that in these cases it's possible to justifiably or excusably kill someone if it's expected that the harm will be great. So expected, is that a subjective criterion, or so what are we talking about here?
I hate to do this, but it's not. It's expected harm, right? So it's the harm that you might prevent, discounted by the probability that you will in fact prevent it, right? So it's not about the harm that you expect subjectively. It's about the expected harm, which is actually an objective notion. Well, sort of, right? It's the harm you would prevent discounted by the likelihood that you would actually prevent.
But there needs to be in the real world at risk.
Yeah.
If you're delusional and you're acting on the basis of a certain harm, which is in fact not happening, that is not within. There's no situation where the probability is reduced to 0. Right? The probability that the person will act and cause harm is 0. So you imagine that somebody's going to press the button, but in fact this is not what's happening.
Right.
You're not crazy. This is just the circumstances that are such. And you're thinking, God, if I don't do anything, this universe is going to collapse. Or it's going to be the end of humanity. Right? Can you ever be justified in a case like this, in shooting down the person?
I don't think so.
Okay. So I'm just wondering. I just wanted to know what that word meant.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Just to follow up on that. A lot of your arguments seem to be based on this balance between proportionality and discrimination, if I'm correct. And Michael Walzer, obviously, he writes a lot about this, just war and arguing about war. And in his arguments, when you have let's say you have a factory, case one, you have a factory which is making tanks and bullets. There are civilians working there.
Right.
They qualify in an equivalent moral standing as soldiers, so they're liable to get bombed. There's a second scenario which is they're making food, they're foodstuffs.
Right.
They're not liable to be bombed. He sees a clear line between the two, but where the gray comes in is things like, electricity. Hospitals are powered by electricity. Clearly bombing this would cause great distress presumably to those in the hospital, but it also is a direct line into their communication networks and whatnot.
Sure.
In your view, where does that line where would you place that line? And my second question is, Walter resolves that problem between proportionality and discrimination on the side of proportionality when it has to do with like supreme emergencies. You know, you have that nuclear bomb where he characterizes World War II as being this supreme emergency scenario because, you know, the Holocaust, he is a Jewish writer, like he cannot bring himself to say that the Allies were unjustified, despite their methods on both sides. In your line of thinking, would such actions, can you justify such actions, or are sort of necessary atrocities that they would say, is that merely an excuse or an excusable behavior?
Oof, okay, a lot of stuff. Okay, so so the first part, right? Okay, so Walzer, you know, obviously a great thinker, has unfortunately misled generations of students and philosophers about the munitions case. Actually, the munitions workers are not liable to intentional killing. I mean, under the law, morally, you know, I don't know, but you know, lots of people think that, you know, oh, it's okay to kill munitions workers. Actually, not really. Intentionally, you know, maybe as an unintended side effect, but you know, you can't bomb the munitions factory during the day while they're all working if you could just as easily bomb it at night when everybody's gone, right? It's not like their lives count for nothing. So you do have to justify unintentionally killing them. So, so the paper obviously is about just distinction, right? How sure do you have to be who's who? It's not really about proportionality. And so some of the questions, so the first set of questions about, you know, electricity and hospitals and things like that, those are really all proportionality questions. It's not, the question isn't, you know, is this individual liable to attack? It's, you know, would the harm to non-liable individuals, right, patients in the hospital and so on, be so great that whatever military advantage would come from bringing down the power grid would be disproportionate. So I don't really say anything about that in the paper. What I've said elsewhere is that, you know, ultimately the proportionality inquiry should probably bottom out into an analysis of basically, if you don't strike this target, how many more of your soldiers will die to achieve your just cause, going about it some other way, and how does that increased loss to your own forces compare with the loss with the civilians that you would kill, taking into account the distinction between killing and letting die, because you'd be killing the civilians rather than, as opposed to allowing more of your soldiers to be killed. So that's sort of my kind of rough view about how to go about answering those questions. And similarly with the supreme emergency stuff, so I actually think Walzer's argument was slightly different. It wasn't just the Holocaust, it was the idea that a Nazi victory in World War II would unleash, right, similar horrors around the world, right?
Whole of Europe,
right.
England going down in flames.
Yeah, it would be, so right, so the ultimate victory of evil in the world, right? So, you know, look, so first we'd want to know whether the, you know, fire bombings of Dresden and Munich and Berlin were actually necessary, whether they actually, you know, facilitated the end of the war, and you know, what the alternatives really were. And then there's also just the basic question of whether the prohibition on intentional killing is absolute or has this kind of threshold. And, you know, I try to stay kind of non-committal on that. My own intuitions are on the absolutist side of things, but I try not to hinge any of my arguments on that, because that's probably a minority view. But certainly it's a lot of, yeah. So anyway, so there are a bunch of questions we'd have to answer before we even got to that, right? Was it really necessary? You know, what were the alternatives? And then there's just a basic choice or judgment about how strong this prohibition really is. Yeah, and that's one that, yeah, people have different views, and it's not really clear how to settle that dispute. So.
Just on this note, please join me in thanking
Nope.
Professor Haque, Mohamad. Great talk.